Hi, my name is Torgeir Aadland, and I'm an associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I'm also part of Engage, Center for Engaged Education through Entrepreneurship. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about student-centered versus teacher-centered in entrepreneurship education. So when we talk about entrepreneurship education, we do not only talk about one thing. We find entrepreneurship education in many different disciplines. Of course, in the business school, but also in the engineering department, and also among medical faculty. And the curriculum is varying based on which department we are in and on the background of the students. So entrepreneurship education is a bit difficult to categorize. However, if you look at the history of entrepreneurship education, we can see a trend of different entrepreneurship education types. So if we start approximately 3 or 4 decades ago, and we look at the beginning of entrepreneurship education, when it started to become popular, we saw that entrepreneurship education looked like this. Students sitting in a big lecture hall, listening to a teacher or perhaps a guest entrepreneur coming in and telling his or her story about how to be an entrepreneur and how it is to experience the entrepreneurial behavior. And when the lecture was over, the students went home, perhaps had some readings and did an assignment and came back for another lecture, perhaps with some discussion, but the students were fairly passive. Then, over the years, and in higher education in general, we saw a development towards more problem-based education. And this also occurred in entrepreneurship education. This becoming more problem-based, and the students were given assignments, perhaps using certain tools or methods decided by the teacher, and then solved certain problems. The students became more participatory. They decided upon some of their activities themselves, however set in a context by the teacher. Then, in the beginning of this millennium, we saw a development of a new type of entrepreneurship education, something called venture creation programs, where the students started their own venture as a part of their educational pathway, like this student here trying to sell her items to this gentleman. So in this type of education, the students decided on themselves what they would like to do, which tools and method they would like to use, and which activities they would like to focus on. So in this development, we see that we have moved from a more teacher-centered side of entrepreneurship education over to a more student-centered side of entrepreneurship education. And in the literature, these are described in many different ways. First of all, we have that the teacher-centered side is also individual-centered, meaning that the students are individuals that we are trying to embed some knowledge in by talking to them. They are fairly passive and sitting in a classroom. They don't have really ownership over the education. On the other side, on the more student-centered side, we have what we call action-based entrepreneurship education, where the students are active doing entrepreneurial activities. They have ownership over the activities that they're doing and the project that they participate in. Another way of describing this is that on the teacher-centered side, we educate about entrepreneurship, meaning that we're telling what entrepreneurship is or different context of entrepreneurship. But the students, again, are fairly passive in the educational context. On the other hand, on the student-centered side, we have what we call education through entrepreneurship, meaning that the students learn by being entrepreneurs, testing entrepreneurial activities in the educational context, but also outside university. And over the latter years, people have said that the teacher-centered, that is old school. That is the way we used to do it, but now we should move more towards the student-centered side and the ideal approach. However, as I will show you, there are some issues connected to both sides here, and maybe this is not actually the ideal approach. So let's start with an example of that. Imagine that you are responsible for a course where the students are self-directed. The students are in center. So they decide upon the activities that they are doing. And as we all know, in entrepreneurship, there are a lot of different activities that an entrepreneur needs to do. For instance, work on strategy or do some financials. They have to do a marketing plan or work with their marketing strategy. And of course, they need to develop their product or their service. However, students, like most of us, have a favorite topic often. For instance, strategy. So if the students are self-directed, deciding upon which activity they would like to do and what they would like to focus on, many often chooses their favorite, like strategy, and focus on that, and forgetting about financials, marketing, and product development. Thus, perhaps not obtaining the learning objective in the course as set by the teacher. Another example with the more student-centered, or an issue with the more student-centered entrepreneurship education, is that if it is a mandatory course for students, and the students can decide themselves, they often tend to choose the less risky and perhaps more easy way out of their assignment. Over the years, I've been lecturing in the nursing department, and in that department, they had a course on innovation where the students decided themselves upon which activities they would like to focus on. And the students did an excellent job. However, the projects they worked on were without any uncertainty often, and were low on risk, and were quite low on innovation. Easy project to work on, not the extreme projects, and that might be a good thing for nursing students since they are not becoming entrepreneurs. However, they might not get to experience the real entrepreneurial activities by choosing those projects that are less risky, less uncertain. A third example is more on the teacher-centered side of the dimension. This guy here coming into class, being an entrepreneur, telling about his story in developing his product or his business, he needs to be prepped before coming into class, such that his talk is matching the curriculum that the students are having in that particular class. So if he's coming in and talking about something different or avoiding the topic, that might be difficult for the students to relate his talk to the actual curriculum and the actual topic. So you see, entrepreneurship education needs to have some sort of balance between the two sides when it comes to student-centered and teacher-centered. So let's try to sum things up a bit. On the teacher-centered side, we often see that we're lacking action. The students are becoming passive and are not experiencing the entrepreneurial activities that they should. However, on the more student-centered side, as I mentioned, they're often doing entrepreneurship, meaning that they choose away the uncertainty and the perhaps risk connected to certain projects to be able to fulfill the requirements set by the teachers. Another point, as I mentioned with the guest lecture, is that it could be difficult to relate the things that the teacher or the guest entrepreneur, the things they are talking about, to practice. If the students don't experience the entrepreneurial activity, it might be difficult for them to relate those topics into how it is to be an entrepreneur, or how it is to be entrepreneurial if they're more or less passive in the classroom. On the other hand, on the more student-centered side, if they're only acting, performing entrepreneurial activities, it might be difficult for them to relate those things to theory. And while some say that the old school or teacher-centered is old school, it's still working. Especially if you want to give the students awareness about entrepreneurship, if that is the objective of the course, or if you want to talk about a certain topic within entrepreneurship, the more old school teacher-centered approach is still working. And I question whether the ideal approach, which some call the more student-centered side of the scale here, I question whether that is an ideal approach if it is alone. I argue that we need some sort of balance when we are designing entrepreneurship education. We need to have some teacher-centered activity to connect to perhaps theory, but we also need a more student-centered activity to connect theory to practice. Thank you.